It was his final flight, and everything was going wrong. Captain Frank Morrison, in the eyes of the young crew, was just a failed old pilot. But when the photograph he found in the cockpit revealed his true identity, everyone at the airport fell to their knees. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale of respect, legacy, and hidden heroism, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Captain Frank Morrison, 65 years old with silver hair and tired eyes, walked slowly toward Gate 43 where his final aircraft waited. After 42 years of flying, today would mark the end of his career. But it wouldn't be the graceful farewell he had imagined. The Boeing 747-400 sat like a sleeping giant, her four massive engines silent in the dawn light. Frank had flown this route, Chicago to London, over 1,000 times. He knew every runway, every air traffic pattern, every cloud formation between here and Heathrow. But today felt different. Today felt wrong. As he approached the aircraft, he could hear the voices of the maintenance crew. Young technicians in crisp blue coveralls clustered around a diagnostic computer, their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. "Systems check complete," announced Jake Patterson, the lead maintenance supervisor. At 28, Jake was confident, efficient, and utterly convinced that modern technology had made the old ways obsolete. All green lights across the board. Frank nodded and began his pre-flight inspection. It was a ritual he had performed thousands of times, checking control surfaces, examining engines, testing hydraulic systems. But as he moved around the massive aircraft, something felt off. The way the morning breeze caught the wing surfaces, the sound the auxiliary power unit made, the smell of the fuel lines. He couldn't put his finger on it, but 42 years of flying had given him an instinct that went beyond instruments and computers. This bird wasn't ready to fly. "Excuse me," Frank said, approaching the maintenance crew. "I'm getting some unusual readings on the hydraulic pressure gauge. Mind if we double-check the primary system?" Jake looked up from his tablet, barely concealing his irritation. "Captain Morrison, I've run full diagnostics twice. Everything is within normal parameters. The computer shows no faults." "I understand," Frank replied quietly, "but I'd like to manually inspect the hydraulic lines. Sometimes these older 747 seconds develop issues that don't show up on the sensors." A younger technician named Marcus snorted. "Older 747 seconds? Captain, this aircraft was manufactured in 2003. It's got more computing power than the space shuttle. If there was a problem, we'd know about it." Frank felt the familiar sting of being dismissed. It had been happening more frequently in recent years. The young pilots with their glass cockpits and fly-by-wire systems. The technicians who trusted screens more than experience. The supervisors who valued efficiency over intuition. "Look, Captain," Jake said, his tone patronizing. "I know you've been flying for a long time, but aviation has evolved. We don't rely on hunches anymore. We rely on data." Frank nodded slowly. He'd heard this speech before. He was a relic, a dinosaur, a symbol of the old days when pilots actually flew airplanes instead of managing computer systems. 2 hours later, Frank sat in the cockpit with his co-pilot, Sarah Chen, a sharp 34-year-old who had been flying for 8 years. She was competent, professional, and like most of her generation, she had learned to fly on aircraft where computers made most of the decisions. "Pre-flight checklist complete," Sarah announced. "Tower has cleared us for pushback." Frank looked at the instrument panel. Every light was green, every gauge showed normal readings. But that feeling in his gut, the one that had kept him alive through 4 decades of flying, was screaming that something was wrong. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want to delay takeoff for 30 minutes. She looked at him with surprise. "Sir, is there a problem?" "Just a feeling," Frank admitted. "Something doesn't feel right." Sarah's expression shifted from surprise to concern. Not concern about the aircraft, but concern about her captain. She'd heard the whispers in the pilot lounge. Captain Morrison was losing his edge. He was hesitant, uncertain. Maybe it was time for him to retire. "Captain," she said gently, "all systems are showing normal. Maintenance has signed off. We're fully fueled and ready. The passengers are boarded. If we delay without a specific mechanical issue." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Frank knew what would happen. Another black mark on his record. Another sign that he couldn't handle modern aviation. Another step toward the forced retirement that seemed inevitable. "You're right," he said finally. "Let's go." The pushback proceeded normally. The taxi to the runway was smooth. As they approached runway 28L, Frank ran through the takeoff checklist one final time. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Chicago Tower. American 47 Heavy ready for takeoff, Sarah announced. American 447 Heavy, cleared for takeoff, runway 28L. Have a good flight. Frank advanced the throttles. The four massive engines spooled up to full power, their combined 240,000 pounds of thrust pushing the 400-ton aircraft forward. The Boeing began to accelerate down the runway, gathering speed with the familiar rhythm Frank had felt 10,000 times before. Vone, the speed at which they were committed to takeoff. There was no turning back now. VR, rotation speed. Frank pulled back on the controls, and the massive aircraft lifted off the runway, climbing into the Chicago morning sky. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The aircraft was responding properly. The engines were producing full power, and they were climbing at the standard rate. Frank began to relax. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe it was just nerves about his final flight. Then, at 3,000 feet, it happened. The number 2 engine, the inner engine on the right wing, began to vibrate. Not the normal vibration of a massive jet engine, but something different, something wrong. "Sarah," Frank said calmly, "I'm showing unusual vibrations on engine 2. She scanned her instruments. "I'm not seeing anything, Captain. All readings are normal." The vibration increased. Frank could feel it through the controls, through his seat, through the very structure of the aircraft. But the computer system showed nothing. No warnings, no alerts, no indication of any problem. Chicago departure, American 447 Heavy requesting vectors back to O'Hare, was showing a possible engine issue. American 447 Heavy, what is the nature of your emergency? Frank hesitated. How could he explain that he could feel something wrong with the aircraft when all the instruments showed normal operation? No declared emergency at this time, Chicago. Just requesting precautionary return to field. In the passenger cabin, flight attendant Jennifer Walsh noticed that the passengers were beginning to look concerned. The aircraft was banking more steeply than normal, and there was an unusual vibration that even the non-pilots could feel. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Sarah was growing increasingly worried about her captain's mental state. All systems were showing normal. The flight management computer indicated no faults. Yet Captain Morrison seemed convinced there was a serious problem. "Captain," she said carefully, "I'm not seeing any indication of engine trouble. Are you sure about this?" Frank looked at her, and in that moment he saw what everyone else saw. An old pilot, past his prime, imagining problems that didn't exist, making decisions based on feelings rather than facts. A liability. "Continue the approach," he said quietly. As they descended back toward O'Hare, Frank's hands moved over the controls with the precision of 4 decades of experience. But inside, he was dying. This would be the end, not just of his final flight, but of his reputation. He would be remembered as the pilot who panicked on his last day, who couldn't trust his instruments, who let his nerves get the better of him. The approach proceeded normally. The landing was smooth. As the aircraft rolled to a stop at the gate, Frank could already see the maintenance crews waiting. The incident would be investigated. His decision to return would be questioned. His fitness for duty would be evaluated. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare," came the standard announcement. But for Frank, it felt like a funeral. As the passengers deplaned, Frank sat alone in the cockpit, staring at the instruments that had betrayed him. Or had he betrayed them? After 42 years, had he finally lost the ability to separate real problems from imagined ones? He opened the small storage compartment beside his seat to retrieve his flight bag. That's when he saw it. Tucked behind some charts and manuals was an old photograph, yellowed with age and bent at the corners. It must have fallen out of his bag months ago and gotten wedged in the compartment. He pulled it out carefully. The photograph showed 8 young men in military flight suits, standing in front of a B-52 Stratofortress. They were squinting in the bright sunlight of what looked like a desert airbase. Their faces were young, confident, immortal. Frank recognized himself immediately. Third from the left, 23 years old, with a cocky grin and eyes that had never seen war. But it wasn't just any photograph. Written across the bottom in faded ink were the words, 509th Bomb Wing, Anderson AFB, Guam, December 1979. Frank stared at the image, and suddenly he was back there. Back when flying meant something different. Back when trusting your instincts wasn't a weakness, but a survival skill. Sarah noticed him holding the photograph. "Captain, what is that?" Frank looked up at her, and for the first time in years, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen things beyond civilian aviation. "Before I flew passengers," he said quietly, "I flew bombers, B-52 seconds, Strategic Air Command. We didn't have computers to tell us when something was wrong. We had to feel it. And when you're carrying nuclear weapons over the Pacific Ocean, you better be damn sure your feelings are right." Sarah stared at him, seeing him differently for the first time. This wasn't just an old airline pilot. This was someone with a history she couldn't imagine. Frank continued, his voice growing stronger. "In 1980, during a training mission over the Pacific, I was flying a B-52 when I felt a vibration that the instruments couldn't detect. My co-pilot told me everything looked normal. My flight engineer said all systems were green, but I knew something was wrong." He paused, looking back at the photograph. "I diverted to Wake Island, against orders, against protocol. My commander was furious. They were going to court-martial me, until the maintenance crew found a stress fracture in the wing spar that was invisible to all the testing equipment they had. If we had continued the mission, the wing would have failed over the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean." Sarah's mouth fell open. She had never heard this story. None of the younger pilots had. "The Air Force gave me a commendation for that flight," Frank said. "Not because I followed procedures, but because I trusted 40,000 hours of flying experience over what the computers were telling me." Just then, Jake Patterson appeared at the cockpit door. He looked embarrassed and concerned. "Captain Morrison, I need to speak with you." Frank looked up. "What is it, Jake?" "We completed the post-flight inspection on engine number 2. We found something unusual." Frank felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of unusual?" "There's a microscopic crack in one of the turbine blades. It wouldn't show up on any of our diagnostic equipment, and it wasn't causing any measurable performance loss. But," Jake paused, looking confused, "but our metallurgy expert says that crack was maybe 30 minutes away from catastrophic failure." The cockpit fell silent. "If it had failed at altitude, with a full passenger load," Jake trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah stared at Frank with new understanding. The vibration he had felt, the instinct that had told him something was wrong, it hadn't been the paranoia of an aging pilot. It had been the finely tuned senses of a master aviator detecting a problem that modern technology couldn't identify. "How many lives?" Frank asked quietly. 347 passengers and crew," Sarah whispered. "You saved 347 lives." Word of the incident spread quickly through O'Hare. Within hours, the story had reached the airline's corporate headquarters. The pilot who had been written off as past his prime had just prevented one of the worst aviation disasters in history. But the real revelation came later that evening, when Captain Morrison's military records were finally reviewed by airline management. Records that had been buried in old files, forgotten in the rush of hiring civilian pilots. Frank Morrison hadn't just been a bomber pilot. He had been one of the most decorated aviators in Strategic Air Command history. During the Cold War, when nuclear deterrence meant keeping B-52 seconds in the air 24 hours a day, Frank had flown missions that most people would never know about. The photograph Sarah had seen was from one of those missions. A 30-hour flight over the Arctic Ocean, carrying enough nuclear weapons to level half of Eastern Europe. When one of their engines had failed over the North Pole, Frank had nursed the damaged bomber back to base through a storm that would have killed lesser pilots. He had the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, with multiple oak leaf clusters, commendations for airmanship that went beyond what civilian aviation could imagine. And for the last 20 years, he had been flying passenger jets, using those same instincts to keep ordinary people safe, while younger pilots and technicians dismissed him as obsolete. The next morning, Frank Morrison was called into the chief pilot's office. He expected to be questioned about his decision to divert. Instead, he found himself facing not just his supervisor, but the airline's CEO, the head of maintenance, and a representative from the FAA. "Captain Morrison," the CEO began, "we owe you an apology, and more than that, we owe you our gratitude." Frank sat quietly as they explained how the metallurgy report had been completed. The crack in the turbine blade would have caused complete engine failure within minutes of their reaching cruising altitude. At 37,000 feet, with a fully loaded aircraft, the result would have been catastrophic. "Your instincts," the chief pilot said, "your ability to detect a problem that our most advanced diagnostic equipment couldn't identify, it saved every life on that aircraft." The FAA representative leaned forward. "Captain Morrison, We've reviewed your military records. Your experience level is extraordinary. We'd like to ask you to consider postponing your retirement. The aviation industry needs pilots with your instincts. Frank looked around the room at these people who, just 24 hours earlier, had seen him as a liability. Now they were asking him to stay. With respect, Frank said quietly, I think it's time for a new generation to take over. But maybe there's a way for the old generation to pass on what we've learned. 6 months later, Captain Frank Morrison stood in front of a classroom at the airline's training center. But he wasn't teaching instrument procedures or navigation techniques. He was teaching something that couldn't be programmed into computers or measured by sensors. He was teaching intuition. Modern aircraft are marvels of technology, he told the class of young pilots. They're safer, more efficient, and more reliable than anything we had in the old days. But technology is only as good as the human operating it. And sometimes, the human has to trust things that can't be measured. In the back of the classroom, Sarah Chen took notes. She was no longer just Frank's former co-pilot. She was his star student, learning to combine modern technology with old-fashioned airmanship. On the wall behind Frank hung the framed photograph. 8 young men in flight suits, standing in front of a B-52. Next to it was a small placard. Captain Frank Morrison, USAF retired. 15,000 hours military flight time. 25,000 hours civilian flight time. Distinguished Flying Cross. Air Medal. And on December 15, 2023, the instincts to save 347 lives when computers couldn't. The photograph had been Jake Patterson's idea. The young maintenance supervisor had become Frank's biggest advocate, often telling anyone who would listen about the day an old pilot taught him that experience couldn't be downloaded or programmed. Frank's story spread throughout the aviation community, not as a criticism of modern technology, but as a reminder that the human element would always be irreplaceable. Sensors could measure, computers could calculate, but only experience could feel the difference between normal and wrong. At airfields across the country, old-timers who had been marginalized and dismissed found themselves being listened to again. Young pilots began seeking out veterans for mentorship. Maintenance crews started asking retired technicians about the subtleties that computers might miss. And somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, on routes Frank had flown 1,000 times, commercial aircraft continue to carry passengers safely to their destinations. Their computers monitor every system, their sensors measure every parameter, and their instruments display every reading. But in the cockpit, pilots trained by Frank Morrison sit with their hands on the controls, feeling for things that can't be measured, trusting instincts that can't be programmed, carrying forward a tradition that connects them to every aviator who ever looked at the sky and knew that flying was more than just managing machines. Because some knowledge can't be taught in classrooms or learned from manuals. Some knowledge comes only from years of experience, from hours of practice, from the accumulated wisdom of pilots who learned to fly when failure meant more than just an incident report. Frank Morrison's final flight didn't end with his retirement. It ended with the understanding that in aviation, as in life, the old ways and the new ways aren't enemies. They're partners. And sometimes, when modern technology reaches its limits, it's the wisdom of experience that brings everyone safely home. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Captain Frank Morrison? Someone whose experience was dismissed as obsolete, only to prove that some knowledge can't be replaced by technology? Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they made a difference. Because these stories remind us that wisdom and experience will never go out of style. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Human Stories. Help us honor the veterans, the experts, and the experienced professionals who continue to make our world safer, even when others can't see their value. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important warnings can't be heard by computers. They can only be felt by those who have learned to listen. Thank you for watching.